Hello, so this is going to be a shortish video looking at a possible essay topic that could potentially come up in your exam at GCSE level. And I'm going to be focusing on the topic of the madness of Macbeth. So this is the sort of question that could possibly come up, something along the lines of to what extent could Macbeth be considered a character driven to madness, or something along those lines, something to do with the mental aspect of Macbeth or other characters within the play. So we're going to start off by looking at to what extent are the witches responsible for Macbeth's madness. So to start with, we could potentially argue that the witches sow the seeds of destruction, detailing Macbeth's destiny, albeit in an ambiguous fashion. And this is a theme that's recurrent throughout the play, and that's the witches prophesying Macbeth's destiny. Although it could also be argued that Macbeth would not have pursued the acts that led to his perceived madness if it were not for the witch's prophecy. You could easily argue against this, though, as the witches never outrightly tell Macbeth to actually murder anyone or commit any acts. They simply state that he is going to become king, among other things. On the other hand, they are deliberately ambiguous, and perhaps they know full well that Macbeth will make the decisions that he makes, and they simply sow the seeds for these. Can the witches be considered responsible? They do not actually instruct Macbeth to commit any murder or crime. It's Macbeth who decides upon taking his perceived fate into his own hands and killing Duncan, Banquo, Macduff's family, etc. A quotation we could potentially look at here: or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? And there's a sort of a strange insinuation there that Macbeth may have taken drugs, and that could certainly be influencing what appears to him as well as Banquo. Even early on, Macbeth is wary of his consciousness and questions his own vision. Could this quotation itself be the first indication of the madness that then ensues and follows? It's perhaps also worth considering that this occurs after Macbeth has slaughtered countless foes in the first battle in the play. Could this affect his mental judgment and vision? Although an argument against that is perhaps the fact that it does not explain that Banquo shares in this vision as well. Although it's certainly an interesting idea to pursue, that is the vision of the witches indeed driven by the fact he's just come out of a battle where he's murdered countless people. Certainly one could argue that killing so many people would certainly have an effect on your mental capacity and judgment. Another idea to pursue is, would an Elizabethan audience, in fact that is a sort of an error there, it's more of a Jacobean audience because King James was in fact in power at the time, although Queen Elizabeth was just before then. So would an Elizabethan audience have assumed the witches hold more responsibility than Macbeth himself, given the stigma and obsession attached to the supernatural powers of witchcraft? And that's also interesting because King James, obviously it's widely known, had a serious obsession with witches and witchcraft. So it certainly could have been included to appease King James as well as many other people during this time period. So here we have a quotation that links to this idea. What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? So this quotation also conforms to the notion that witches were unpleasant and abnormal in appearance. Another way of looking at this quotation, perhaps, is this actually a criticism of Elizabethan superficiality? Is Shakespeare actually criticizing the fact that people believe in witches subtly? If so, a very clever thing to do, given that King James fully believed in them, as did many others. But it's certainly something to consider, just why you would actually even listen to these witches in the first place. Sorry, another idea we could perhaps pursue as well here is that it's also ambiguously implied that witches do have supernatural powers, and this happens early on in the play as well when they're doing their very first prophecy before they even meet Macbeth. They're talking about this sort of unknown sailor when they say, "Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid." In actual fact, this could metaphorically represent Macbeth. This could be evidence that the witches are in fact responsible for contributing towards Macbeth's descent into madness. Here they outline the fact that they are essentially going to prevent him from sleeping, and this actually does become a reality for Macbeth later on in the play, when he is actually unable to sleep because of the acts he has done. But there we have a bit of a conflict in looking at to what extent the witches are actually responsible, because although they prophesize that they are going to prevent him from sleeping, it's actually Macbeth's own decisions and acts that cause him to lose sleep. He is the one that murders the people that he murders. Nobody does this for him. So there's a sort of a conflict there where you could argue to what extent either party is responsible for the madness that is bestowed upon Macbeth. Certainly, it's fair to say the witches do influence certain things, even if it's only just to plant the thoughts that eventually lead to Macbeth pursuing these things. So the next strand of the argument that we could look at, to what extent is Macbeth responsible for his own descent into madness? And for me personally, this is perhaps the most interesting strand of thought when looking at the overall theme of Macbeth's madness. So a quotation we can look at here: "If chance will have me king, chance may crown me." And this is arguably before any sort of madness has overwhelmed Macbeth. And he seems to take a fairly logical stance with regards to the prophecy that's been given to him. And bear in mind, this is also before the influence of Lady Macbeth. So before Macbeth commits to murdering Duncan, he's seemingly relaxed and willing to let fate take its natural path. When not interfering with the natural order of being, the subconscious is free from guilt and anxiety. If one truly believes in the concept of fate, a burden is lifted as no decision or action will have forbearance on the outcome. Essentially saying that by letting fate take its natural course, there is less for your brain or consciousness to worry about. You are simply letting the natural order of events take place. And this certainly links to the contextual ideas of the time period, looking at the great chain of being and not interfering with nature's plan or God's plan. It's interesting that when Shakespeare does attempt to intervene with the fate that is set out before him and essentially tries to force fate to happen for him in becoming king through murdering Duncan, rather than letting some sort of natural occurrence take place that ensures that that happens, that is when things go wrong, and that is when the madness inevitably overcomes him. On another contextual note, it's also worth noting that people did believe that madness was a sign of the devil's work or devil's interference. So it very much links in with the idea of supernatural having some sort of impact on Macbeth. So another quotation we can look at is when he's talking to the witches: "If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not," essentially asking the witches to outlie his destiny before him. Clearly, Macbeth believes in the supernatural. Again, another subtle nod to King James's own beliefs. But it could also be argued that belief in the supernatural superstition is a creation of our own subconsciousness or streams of thought and desire. So, intrinsically, one could argue that in believing in the supernatural, that is, in a sense, a sort of strange sort of madness, because you're defying logic and you're defying things that are real. But it's worth noting that Elizabethans, Jacobians certainly did believe in the supernatural, or a large part of society is. But the question is, does Shakespeare? What is Shakespeare trying to show us here? Is he trying to illustrate that the supernatural is almost a myth, and actually it's our own actions that cause the things to happen around us? Or is it all actually set out before us? And this is actually a theme that is concurrent in many of his plays, Romeo and Juliet, looking at the idea of fate and just how culpable are we for dictating our own fate and destiny, or is it actually all just set out before us and we have no influence over this? Certainly, if you look at the idea that we don't have an influence over this, one could argue Macbeth is not actually responsible at all for his descent into madness. I actually like to take the stance or belief that actually it is Macbeth himself who causes much of his own madness. Although there are things that contribute towards him going mad, it's he himself who commits the murders that he does and the other actions that lead to his madness. Or other witches simply telling Macbeth what he desires to hear, almost like the idea of a fortune teller. So is Macbeth actually ultimately responsible for what he hears? Are the witches simply telling him what he wants to hear in order for him to go and do the things that he does? It's an interesting idea to consider and think about. So Macbeth's madness ultimately descends into a sense of sociopathy, whereby he has no consideration or care for his fellow person, including his wife, it seems, towards the end of the play. You can certainly argue sociopathy is a sort of mental illness. Many murderers and serial killers are sociopaths, whereby they cannot relate or empathize with their victims. Now, I'd argue um, on Macbeth's journey, he certainly shows elements of guilt and regret, but by the end of the play, these seem to have evaporated, and he no longer has these feelings of guilt towards his victims or the things that he's done. By the end of the play, he's not racked with guilt, but ruthlessly protecting his throne, driven by the witch's final premonitions, which have lured Macbeth into a false sense of invincibility. So another quotation we could look at: if the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his Circe's success, that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all here. Fantastic quotation, and very ambiguous when we look at the idea of what the consequence could be. So early on, Macbeth is aware of the consequence Duncan's murder could bestow. The ambiguity lies in what the consequence could be. Could he be referring to the potential of becoming mad? Is he aware at this point even that he knows if he does these things, the consequence is going to be him descending into a sort of madness, unable to control his actions and having an incredibly guilty conscience, etc.? Or could he just be referring to the practical consequences of committing treason, which actually in itself shows this sociopathic tendency as well? So both ideas link to the idea of madness, but it's just a question of how quickly he descends into madness. And is he mad to begin with, or is it something that develops and grows as the play goes on? Another quotation we could look at here: whence is that knocking? How is it with me when every noise appalls me? What hands are here? How they pluck out mine eyes. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? Another excellent quotation here that you guys should potentially learn. So many ideas we can look at in this one. Here he's asking for the great Neptune, god of the sea, to intervene and wash his hands. That in itself is an interesting idea, calling on some sort of divine intervention in order to help him. It's debatable whether it is some form of madness that leads to Macbeth's heightened fear here. Certainly, it seems as if Macbeth hears sounds that may not exist. He's questioning where this knocking has come from, after all. Or or are these sounds sort of distorted by his consciousness as being more sinister than the reality? Is this the beginning of the onset of the madness? Is he hearing things that are not there? Are they amplified by his guilt and what he's about to do? He's pleading for a higher power to intervene in metaphorically washing the blood from his hands, points towards a desperate man. The motive of blood on the hands is a recurring image in the play and could indicate an element of insanity driven by guilt. He's not the only character, obviously. We have Lady Macbeth, who also envisions this blood upon her hands. Is this the brain manifesting the guilt into a sort of physical thing they're actually seeing? Is their brain playing tricks on them? Or is this actually some sort of supernatural occurrence that's going on? I like to think that this is actually a manifestation of the guilt that Macbeth is going through, driven by the actions that he's going to commit. Lastly, we can look at to what extent is Lady Macbeth responsible for Macbeth's madness. So if we look at the quotation, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. Here we have Lady Macbeth attempting to almost convince Macbeth what he should do. Be deceptive towards his king. Look like, be the serpent under the flower. So essentially what she's encouraging Macbeth to do is to hide his true intentions. So to be deliberately deceptive. The fact she's insisting on Macbeth acting in a deceptive manner contributes significantly towards the conflict within Macbeth's own mind. Intrinsically, if we are asked to be deceptive, or if we are being deceptive, that definitely leads to mental anxiety and other emotions. In turn, could develop further and lead to the ultimate madness that Macbeth ends up enduring. It could be argued is a large factor in Macbeth's seeming descent into madness. Similarly, we could also look at the imagery of the serpent, often associated with the Bible. If we look at Adam and Eve and the serpent, the ultimate sign of deception and doing the devil's work, essentially. We have that link, this ideology of the time that insanity, madness is the devil's work. Just another nod to this idea. So Lady Macbeth's consistent questioning of Macbeth's masculinity and commitment to conforming to certain gender stereotypes, while simultaneously betraying his moral compass, also sows the seeds for Macbeth's descent into madness, it could be argued. We have a quotation here that looks at this idea. Glamorous thou art and Cawdor, and shall be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. So here we have Lady Macbeth in one of her monologues talking to herself and discussing the fact she thinks that Macbeth is far too kind a person. She's critical of Macbeth's propensity for kindness. She effectively seeks to eradicate this trait from Macbeth's persona. In doing so, it could be argued that this indirectly leads to Macbeth's descent into madness. Kindness is a trait that is essential in maintaining a healthy mindset. Without, we see Macbeth display full-on sociopathy later in the play. It's interesting that she thinks that Macbeth's kindness is essentially holding him back. Kindness, it is argued, is essential to maintain a healthy mindset and a healthy persona. And if you take that away, you are left with the opposite to kindness. You are left with nastiness, meanness, traits that can be considered evil. And certainly, if you are someone who does not have the propensity for kindness, you are going to lead towards sort of a sociopathic ideology or way of doing things. If we look at all the great evil, real people that have existed throughout history, long after this play was produced, people like Hitler, etc., certainly you could argue they lacked any form of kindness, etc. Another idea we could also look at is it could be argued Lady Macbeth shoulders no responsibility due to the fact she is technically in no position to influence Macbeth in terms of the patriarchal hierarchy that existed at the time. You could argue that Macbeth has no obligation to listen to his wife or anything she instructs him to do. Macbeth is responsible for his own actions. How far is the individual responsible for his own descent into madness? You could argue she certainly guides him, but looking at how society was structured at the time, the man was under no obligation to listen to the woman. Another idea that links to this is quite interesting is the fact that obviously we had a change of monarch at the time. So we went from Queen Elizabeth to King James. And actually, there is no real positive representation of women in this play, and particularly Lady Macbeth is portrayed as a very evil, manipulative character. So there could be a sort of subtle idea that actually, the women in the world are responsible for the men going mad. It could have just been to please King James and criticise the previous monarch, but it's an interesting idea to think about. Another idea to look at is that Lady Macbeth herself actually goes mad, culminating in her suicide. One might argue it's Macbeth who causes her madness through his transformation into a sociopathic king. As Macbeth grows independent of his wife, she in turn loses the power and control that allowed her confidence and empowerment. Once Lady Macbeth is forced into the stereotypical role that her gender and position dictates, she loses the confidence that perhaps prevented her from descending into madness sooner. So it's quite interesting, another idea, that when they slip into their stereotypical roles of gender and power, that is when things go extremely wrong. So there could also be an argument here, a very subtle argument, that Macbeth is almost arguing for more equality in a sense. It's interesting that things only really descend into full-on chaos when Macbeth embraces the role of king and power and all that comes with it and makes decisions independent of his wife. That's arguably when things go truly wrong. So there we have an overview of the ideas we've discussed. I hope you found the video interesting and it's given you some food for thought for ideas you might want to include in your essays. I am aware there are a couple of spelling mistakes within this PowerPoint, just typos actually generally. So apologies for that. It sort of rushed a couple of the last ideas that I put onto this. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful and it will help with your revision. Please like if you did, and any comments that things you'd like to see in future videos or other ideas that we could have perhaps included or discussed within the idea of looking at the madness of Macbeth. Thanks for watching.